afternoon. That was a little loud. Okay. Thank you very much for letting me speak today. I want to thank the TED team, and I also need to thank the White House photographers who have given me a PowerPoint. And we'll get started. I'm not sure that all of you know who FLOTUS is. I did that rather deliberately in the title, but that is the First Lady of the United States, and that will be the topic that I'm going to be addressing today. But I want to get there by way of the theme that was chosen by TEDx for our conference, and that is, of course, not all those who wander are lost. So this is the poem from J.R.R. Tolkien that it was taken from. It was a poem that went through many changes. If you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings, either the movie or the books, then you'll be able to see there's a lot going on in these simple lines. And I just want to draw your attention to them because they have some really interesting applications with first ladies. So let's pause for a second and read, okay? All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. This is a promise of inversions. You think you know, but you don't. Or, more disconcerting, you think you know and you have judged and you are wrong. And in return for realizing that you are gently ignorant and dramatically wrong, we have the second stanza. From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken, the crownless again shall be king. So there's your reward. Now, if we look at this, those who refuse to think about how they were wrong or ignorant suffer a loss. If you read Lord of the Rings, they're the Boromirs, who for that moment didn't believe in the promise, right? And so betrays the fellowship for a moment and realizes the cost, okay? But if you realize the first stanza, and then you move to the second, or verse, right? There's Aragorn, the crownless shall be king. So what I'd like to suggest today is that we think about first ladies and we reassess our knowledge and our understanding in the hopes of receiving some of those rewards. So, popular expectations of the modern first ladies. And I only have a few moments, as we all know, so I'm going with the definition of the modern presidency that starts in the Nixon administration, which is horrifying for me as an Eisenhower person. It means I'm pre-modern, right? But there it is, okay? So, popular expectations of the modern first ladies. So, what we know about these women is that they are expected to be nurturing. And you're seeing Laura and Barbara Bush there holding children who are infected with AIDS, which remains a real issue in the American population, a real source of fear, okay? Rosalind Carter visiting a refugee camp in Thailand. Okay, they're expected to be aristocratic, unless you think that's only a Republican virtue. Please note Hillary Clinton, who definitely has the chin elevated properly, right? Okay? And this is the Nixons with the Shah and Empress of Iran in their palace. They are to be resilient. And that resilience occurs in war zones, it occurs after breast cancer treatments, and it occurs in mourning within the country. They are also to be deferential. The adoring gaze is very common. And you will see the strong feminist Hillary Clinton has it mastered, right? And every positive has negatives. So there's a fear that they will be ambitious. Perhaps they aren't nurturing enough. There's a fear that they will be influential, that they will stand literally over the president, perhaps delivering his concession speech, as Betty Ford did when Gerald Ford acquired, laryngitis at the end of the campaign. And there's a great fear that they will be threatening. So these are very powerful cultural icons, and I include a variety of parties and political ideologies so that you can see their endurance, because I'm sure some of you are sitting out there thinking, I would never do that. Really? Maybe you would, if public opinion was constraining you and constructing your gender performance in a particular way. This is a white, Anglo-Saxon, historicized vision of what a woman should be. And our first ladies are lagging indicators of change in our gender roles within the society. So with that in mind, first ladies confront a real challenge. They are traditional individuals by gender performance, and yet their expectations are directed at them to be highly political, highly partisan, not roles for ladies. So when they travel and they engage in this process of outreach and communication, as you're seeing with Michelle Obama, how do they do that? How do they balance those expectations with those demands? And what I would suggest to you is that it's rather exhausting. This is Barbara and George H.W. Bush, okay? And they do it because it matters. It's personal and political. It's strategic and ideological. It's symbolic and substantive. So as you're watching them, for example, Michelle Obama in China last week, you want to be thinking about the calculations that they're making. I'm going to start with domestic travel and then move to international. And in domestic travel, there's 3 different ways that First Ladies have really contributed actively to the president and to the presidency. And we'll start with campaigning, both presidential and congressional. Now, the candidate in a presidential reelection campaign happens to be their husband, right? Are you there? Cool. So what we're looking at here is how they act as wives, okay? You'll notice them at the podium, and it's very striking that you see the flag behind Michelle Obama. You'll remember in 2008 she was not patriotic, right? She was questioned on all those fronts. So we're really thinking about how do we cast and perform and picture the First Lady, especially when her role extends to campaigning for congressional candidates. This is Laura Bush endorsing Michelle Bachmann. Now, Michelle Bachmann is one of the founders of the Tea Party, and it was a very important endorsement that Laura Bush carried from the presidency. George Bush, as president, was chief of the party, and so this is a very influential decision that the Republican Party will welcome the Tea Party, one that the Republicans might be regretting right now because it's fragmenting their party. Michelle Obama's speech on YouTube was watched by 2.5 million people. If that isn't influence, I don't know what is. But that's campaigning. When we move to governing, what happens? Well, we see more of this, okay? So Pat Nixon's invited to dedicate a park. It's right near the border of California and Mexico. And what happens? Americans and Mexicans show up. But there's a barbed wire fence on the border. And so she reaches past the guards and past the barbed wire, and she thanks people for coming to see her. A huge transnational moment. You're familiar with reading and literacy from the Bushes, but you want to remember that in the context of presidential initiatives. So, for example, we have Bush, the education president. This is HW. We also have W with No Child Left Behind, a very controversial bill that was softened by Laura Bush's emphasis on public libraries. In the same way that we see Michelle Obama talking about let's go and childhood obesity, while her husband is advocating for affordable health care reform. And you've heard of the drug war, the war on drugs. We have Nancy Reagan recommending just say no, the human side of the presidential program. The First Lady who sticks out the most with regard to domestic travel, I think, on all of this is going to be Rosalynn Carter, because she made a campaign promise to reform the mental health care system of our country, and then she followed through on it. So this was a presidential promise. It was a presidential campaign promise made by a First Lady, and she proceeded to keep it, holding hearings all over the country, attending international conferences, and everything else possible. So what you're seeing in these pictures is an outreach that's programmatic, but it's also constitutional, as when Betty Ford advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment. And think about this. When Michelle Obama is reaching out and talking about how we need to support our military families, she is mediating a relationship between the commander-in-chief and soldiers. This is a very powerful mediation and an unusual one. So the final policy entrepreneur that I would draw to your attention, not surprisingly, is Hillary Rodham Clinton. She was charged with advancing Bill Clinton's major campaign promise to reform health care. You'll see here in this picture who's standing behind her. Bill Clinton and Al Gore, behind the First Lady. This is why Hillary Clinton was so formidable and is judged so threatening, because the president was behind her. Her role is to be behind him, right? No. So if we now think about that, what have I just suggested to you? Well, what I've suggested to you is that there are certain things about the ways that First Ladies wander that we want to keep in mind. They humanize, they implement, they create. That's what women's work is when First Ladies wander or travel. This is a very engaged process. So now we turn to international travel, public diplomacy, nation branding, soft power. You've heard most of these terms. And the way that I'm going to work with them is a little bit distinctive. They have broader definitions, but I'm not cheating, I'm just being focused. So public diplomacy, I think that this is one of the most extraordinary examples of public diplomacy in recent United States diplomatic history. And I refer, of course, to the Obama's visit to Africa, particularly to South Africa. This is a very important event, not simply because it was a meeting between iconic leaders, Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, between countries that have a long and difficult history, South Africa and the United States, but also because of the message that it carried. This was an instance where you saw two strains of the African diaspora returning to the continent that their legacies came from, right? So Michelle Obama, with hundreds of years, generations of her family present in the United States, right? Arriving in the United States through the slave trade of the 18 or 1700s, Barack Obama, the more recent immigrant, his father coming from Kenya, both of them returning at least to the continent, all right, of their family origins. And then taking the time to listen to that continent instead of going back and saying, here I am, you lucky things. Aren't you wonderful? Because I'm here. Okay, no. What can you teach me? How do I understand? Michelle Obama listening in museums, okay? The paused moments on Robben Island. These are very powerful things, and it's the start of public diplomacy, which then moves towards, on the basis of that listening, and engaged dialogue. So this is Pat Nixon, okay, up here. Oops, pushed the wrong button. You can tell I'm a rookie. Here we go. She was the first lady to address another country's government. She addressed the Liberian Parliament. Rosalind Carter over here is speaking with the president of Ecuador. She was given extensive briefings by the National Security Council so she could advance American interests. And here at the bottom left, you have Michelle Obama addressing young women in Soweto. So this is a very powerful combination of information that's based upon listening and moving towards the next step, which is influencing. So we can talk, but can we persuade? This is the most famous of Rodham Clinton's speeches. It's the 1995 address in Beijing, but what you may not know about that very famous speech is that it was tried and refined and tried again. So it was delivered approximately 5 to 10 times to a variety of international organizations before it was presented globally at this UN conference. I've excerpted the section that relates directly to women's rights and to women's voice because that's what we're dealing with in this slide presentation. But one of the most far-reaching aspects of this speech was actually her assertion about LGBT rights, and it was a very powerful and formidable one. So if we move from that to nation branding, now what we're looking at is a more assertive statement about the United States. And so throughout Afghanistan and throughout the war in Afghanistan, a variety of things have been given out to children wrapped or branded with the American flag, whether it's treats or soccer balls. Soccer balls I find a little problematic, kicking the flag around, but soccer balls are popular, okay? So here we are literally branding the United States. Air Force One is probably the most prominent and familiar brand that you've ever seen, and it certainly goes to the heart of wandering. You can see this is actually I have to stop pushing the wrong button. Here we go. This is an arrival ceremony, and you can see that it really allows us to pretty much take over the stage as Americans, even though we're in someone else's country, okay? And we have Hillary and then Michelle Obama both exiting the plane, and really symbols of American engineering power and might. Again, nation branding, an assertion of the United States' power. Now, what's more subtle is when we look at how our first ladies perform once they're in country. And I think that that's an extremely important consideration for us to keep in mind, because these are women who are experts at performance. Now, when I say performance, I'm not suggesting that they are somehow hypocritical or artificial or whatever. I'm thinking about the very best kind of theater, which allows us to see and understand our humanity from a new aspect, from a different perspective, in a way that allows us to understand that we are all performers, that our behavior matters deeply. And so here, on a single trip to the Mideast, Laura Bush spanned, from a variety of countries and went from Israel to a series of meetings in different Arabic nations. And you can see these in the pictures. The question is, by her demeanor, which values does she respect? And which values does she challenge? Whose rights does she uphold? and whose rights does she question? These are very telling comparative photographs that allow us to think about the First Lady engaging in a statement about the United States and its values and its implications for foreign relations. So soft power comes last, and there's a gender dynamic right there in that tone, right? I mean, soft. So it's okay for women to do it. But when was the last time that you heard women described as carrying forward any form of military economic power? Not so much, unless it's in a controversial context. So let's look at this, okay? Pat Nixon, in 1970, there's an earthquake in the Andes. Between 40 and 60,000 people die. And not too many people pay attention outside of the immediate area, but Pat Nixon does. And so she launches a public-private partnership that raises money and sends jets of basically supplies down to Peru, and she goes as well. And then she insists on going to the area where the earthquake happened, bringing along a bunch of media, right? So what we get out of this is an awareness of the ways in which wealth in the United States can then be moved and mobilized by the First Lady. For this, she was given the Order of the Sun, which is one of the highest honors that the Peruvian government gives to civilians. Rosalind Carter took active efforts to really intervene in the Cambodian refugee crisis. This is spillover into Thailand. You're familiar with it in terms of the killing fields. But beyond mobilizing resources, both private and public, the other thing that Rosalind Carter sought to do, with the support of her husband, Jimmy Carter was always engaged in human rights, was to really start naming things that were wrong. So this isn't a natural disaster. This was human choice. To make people suffer, to kill people was a human choice, and it needs to be named. Similarly, we see active engagement by Laura Bush. We're delivering government support and government supplies, but here what we're doing is we're actively arguing and fighting and developing diplomatic alliances, democratic values through the government programs. So what does all this mean? Well, what I would suggest to you is that those gender roles that are played by First Ladies are really complicated and cause us often to miss the fact that they're engaged very deeply in political, partisan, diplomatic, and military exercises, winning hearts and minds at home and abroad, and therefore engaging in a kind of exercise that we don't usually attribute to them. So if we want to free ourselves and provide ourselves with more democratic opportunities, we need to step back and free them from the constraints we impose upon them. So this is the tale of Air Force One, and this is a statement by Rosalind Carter, which I think really goes to the heart of those inversions. So if we honor their wandering, then perhaps the crownless will be king. Thank you very much.